Well, hello everyone. Welcome. I have 14:30 Central Time straight up. Let's go ahead and get going. In the past 2 years, the FAA has been replacing the Practical Test Standards, the PTS, with the Airman Certification Standards, also known as the ACS. The Private Pilot Airplane and Instrument Rating Airplane were released 2 years ago, and the Commercial Pilot Airplane was released last year. For 2018, the private, instrument, and commercial have all undergone revisions. These revisions were driven by many factors, and we will discuss these change drivers, what was changed, and how those changes will affect you, the end user. This presentation will cover the private, instrument, and commercial individually. Many of the changes will be shown to you in this presentation. Before we get started, there are some introductions I'd like to make, and I will cover some webinar operating procedures. My name is Robert Terry. I am assigned to the Airman Testing Branch, AFS 630, as an Operations Aviation Safety Inspector. Our panelists today are Margaret Morrison, Ricky Crittemeyer, and Jeff Spangler from the Airman Testing Branch. And from the Airman Training and Certification Branch, AFS 810, we have Richard Orensel and Jim Saccone. All of our panelists are also operations inspectors. During the webinar, the panelists will answer your questions. They will do their best to give you an answer during the webinar. For those questions that they are not able to answer due to time, or if the answer requires an interpretation of the rules, we will need to send you an answer in an email. All the questions and answers will be sent to all who have registered for the webinar. I'll also send this PowerPoint and my notes to everyone who registered for the webinar. Please feel free to use this presentation if needed for any training or testing purposes. We are recording this webinar, and we do plan to make it available on YouTube. So some webinar instructions. If you have a question or two during the webinar, you may submit your question in the question box you see on your screen. Again, if we do not answer your question during the webinar, we will send all the questions and answers out in an email to all who have registered for the webinar. Is your control panel missing? You may be wondering, where is my control panel? Well, it is minimized. To open it up, click the red arrow at the top of your screen to bring it out. If you're having difficulty hearing the webinar, we have found in the past that using speakers on a computer monitor does not work very well. We suggest that you use the call-in number instead of your computer speakers. If there are audio or visual problems during the webinar, please let us know through the question box. One of our panelists will let me know if there is an issue, and we will get it resolved. So here's the topics that we will cover today. The focus of this webinar is not to inform you about how the ACS works. However, I will give some background information and some regulatory information in the first few slides. The private and instrument ACSs have been active for 2 years, and the commercial has been in use for a year now. You, the end user, have a pretty good working knowledge of the ACS. To use an analogy, you've seen the forest, it's time to look at the trees. We'll cover the private, instrument, and commercial individually and show you many of the changes that were made and the reason each change was made. This project was a collaboration between the Airman Testing Branch and the General Aviation Policy Division. Our goal seemed easy enough when we started these revisions. Just align the like tasks and elements between the private, instrument, and commercial. For example, a VMC demonstration at the private and commercial level are the same except for the standards. Well, this task turned out to be a little more daunting than expected. After significant work, phone calls, and revisions to our working spreadsheets, the project was completed. We considered input from many sources, both those internal and external to the FAA. The question we continually asked our group was, is this usable for the end user? Will they understand what this is? Finally, there have been some changes to the standards in the ACSs, and I will show you what those are also. Okay, a little bit of background before we get going. The ACS is the standard for airman certification. It is the system that the FAA, evaluators, instructors, and applicants will use in the certification process. As you can see, testing for the knowledge test and the practical test begins with the ACS. It is the standard. The standard then drives guidance. In the case of the ACS, guidance is FAA handbooks and other FAA publications. FAA guidance material is where all FAA knowledge test questions are developed, as well as the questions for the practical test. Change management is how the FAA conveys the updates to the user. This webinar is an example of change management. The visual that we used here is also an important part of change management. On the left side of the slide is the Airman Testing Branch's webpage. This is where all changes that are made in testing is posted. This is also the place where you, the user of the ACSs, can contact the testing branch. We encourage you to email us through our webpage with your questions, comments, complaints, and yes, even your accolades. We, the testing branch, will answer your emails. Really, we will. Over the past year, we have kept and compiled all the comments we have received about the ACSs and incorporated some of those comments into the changes that were made in the latest revisions of the ACSs. Our internal work group reviewed every comment from the past year. The final slide in this presentation has our web address and the Airman Testing email address at the end. And as I said, I will email all the people who signed up for the webinar a copy once we are done. The ACSs are based on a rule, 14 CFR Part 61. But what gives Part 61 the authority to say how, why, and what the applicant must know, consider, and do to become a pilot? For that, we need to look at Title 49 USC, which is United States Code 44703 and 44702. These are statutes or law. A statute is an act of legislature that declares, prescribes, or commands something, a specific law expressed in writing. This gives the administrator the authority to use the ACS as the testing document that contains the standard for airman certification. The ACS is supported by an Aviation Rulemaking Committee, also known as an ARC. The ARC provides rulemaking advice and recommendations to the administrator with respect to pilot certification through the ACS system. Okay, so what changed? As we progress through this presentation, you'll see that some of the changes are editorial, meaning a word was wrong or a comma was in the wrong place. As I said earlier, one of our goals was to align like tasks and elements amongst the three ACS documents. Of course, there are more tasks and elements alike between the private and the commercial. There are some that are common to all three. For example, a single engine approach in a multi-engine airplane. Other changes that you will see is that we have moved some task elements around. We have even combined some elements to make them more clear with the goal of making them easier to use. I will point out some of these as we go through this presentation. Updates to the appendices. The appendices are an important part of each of the ACSs. There are test-taking tips, testing qualifications, of course, from the appropriate parts of 14 CFR Part 61, English language requirements, safety of flight, and a lot more information that is useful to an applicant, an instructor, and evaluators. We have made some changes here too, and I will cover some of those. A few of the standards have changed. I will also hit some of these in this presentation. As a user of the ACSs, the best place to start when looking for changes is the Major Enhancements page. This page will give you a pretty good look at what has been changed, but not always the place the change was made. For example, we replaced raise lower the landing gear, raise lower the flaps with configure the airplane as per the manufacturer's recommendation. This is a change that was made in many places, and to list all of them was not practical. So please take some time to review the ACS or ACSs that you will use. This might sound strange to some people, but read the document. Global changes that we have made to all three of the ACSs. So within the past year, the FAA went through a reorganization. Gone are the days of regions such as Southwest Region and Southern Region, etc. The individual flight standards district offices are still in place, and the way you, the flying public, will more than likely still talk with the same FAA employees like you always have. The change that will be most visible to you will be that the routing codes for some of the divisions and branches that you may have had contact with have changed, such as the Airman Certification Branch. They are now identified as AFB-720, not AFS-760 like you're accustomed to. The other change you should see is that FAA employees are to refer to these divisions and branches by their official names. So we will refer to the testing branch as the Airman Testing Branch, not AFS 630. Through this presentation, I'll try to use both names as all of us become accustomed to this new change. More global changes. As I think everyone has seen by now, the requirement to use a complex airplane for the single-engine commercial and single-engine CFI practical test has been eliminated. The work group did anticipate this change might happen after these ACSs were activated. To prepare for this change, we decided to use configure the airplane as per the manufacturer's recommendation. For example, if an airplane is fixed gear but has a constant speed propeller is used for a practical test, the applicant is to be tested as per that manufacturer's recommendation. This is to be a catch-all for any airplane that meets the requirements of 61.45 for a practical test. Task and elements. There are only a few tasks and elements that are used in all three of the ACSs. You will see many more like tasks and elements between the private and the commercial. Our goal was to make these tasks and elements the same. One that is the same across all three is adding a multi-engine with an instrument rating. All three must do an instrument approach. You'll see that these three tasks are the same. For the private and the commercial, you should see that all like tasks and elements are the same, except for the standards for the maneuver between the certification categories. Basic Med has now been allowed for about a year now. It has been placed in the ACSs. It is now a testing element for both the knowledge test and the practical test. Special Air Traffic Rules, SATR, and Special Flight Rules Area, SFRA, are now testing elements also. You will see that we have included, if applicable, in the element. If a person is taking a practical test where SATR or SFRA does not apply to their area, this item is not to be tested. We also included runway lighting systems to the communications and signals task. We realized as we revised the ACSs we did not have runway light systems as a testing item. This now allows runway light systems to be tested. Now let's look a little bit more at the private. Here you see the normal approach and landing task with skill 10 and the changes that were made to the private ACS. The top example from 2017 did not include the standard of landing within 400 feet or on a specified point. It is now included in the 2018 private ACS. This was an item that we received many comments about. We agreed and it has been added back into the standard. The proper pitch attitude at touchdown is also now included. The other changes you see here is that we removed ASEL, AMEL, ASES, and AMES. This task applies to all classes in the airplane category. So the airplane's longitudinal axis will be aligned with and over the runway for land planes or the landing path for seaplanes. Area of Operation 9, Task Alpha, Emergency Descent, added airspeed and altitude standards. This is another one of our finds as we reviewed the private ACS. The commercial had an airspeed and altitude standard. The private did not. So this standard was added to the private ACS. You will see that the multi-engine tasks and elements have the most changes. As we were reviewing and comparing the private, instrument, and commercial ACSs, we saw that these maneuvers were very different, so we made them the same. You will see that we added simulated in the task name. This is to show that the engine failure is to be simulated. To reinforce this, we also added that the evaluator is to establish zero thrust on the inoperative engine in Skill 2. Also, in the task name, we added solely to reference by instruments. This aligns this maneuver as it is described in Part 61. You will also see in Skill 4, we deleted bank angle and replaced it with use flight controls in the proper combination as recommended by the manufacturer. This allows the applicant to follow the proper procedure for an engine failure as it is outlined in the POH or AFM. The changes that were made to Area of Operation 10, Task Charlie, multi-engine operations on the previous slide, were also applied to Task Delta on this slide. For reference, I put the 2017 task name here to compare it to the 2018 task name. One other small change on this page is that the landing and completing the landing checklists are now two separate elements. Since these are really two separate steps, they needed to be separated. While I have pointed out these changes, you're encouraged to look at these tasks and all of them to become familiar with the changes. The standards have not changed in these tasks. However, you will see new language that is used. The reason for this change is not to box an applicant, their instructor, or the evaluator into an element that cannot be done or is unsafe for them to do in the airplane that is used for the practical test. The private appendices. Please review the English standard that is in Appendix 1. There have been some updates there. We added some stuff from AC 60-28. A new part of Appendix 3 has been added about the Airman Knowledge Test Report. The importance of an applicant using their correct name in the same way, spelling, and order throughout the certification process is very important. When an applicant uses a different spelling or order of their name or names for the knowledge test and then for the practical test in IACRA or a Paper 8710-1 application, this can and will delay the process of their application at Airman Records. Appendix 5, Practical Test Roles, Responsibilities, and Outcomes, has additional information. For unsatisfactory performance, there have been some changes here also. We have heard for years the complaint, why does the applicant fail the entire area of operation if they only failed one task? Well, the answer is found in the rule. Due to this being anchored in Part 61, we cannot make that change here. We must follow what the rule allows or does not allow. However, we did attempt to make the process easier to follow. In the current ACSs for private and commercial, we left out an important sentence from the PTS. We have put the requirement for a person who wants to add an instrument rating when they remove the center thrust limitation that they must also complete the requirements for removing the multi-engine VFR only limitation. Appendix 6, Safety of Flight Multi-Engine Considerations. We have removed the requirement for a multi-engine airplane to be used that is not certified with in-flight unfeathering capability. We also removed the language about a type rating. It simply did not apply. Appendix 7 says that the airplane used for the practical test must meet the requirements of 61.45. This change was to remain consistent with the commercial ACS and the removal of the complex airplane for the practical test. Appendices 9 and 10 have been updated to show changes to the references used in the appropriate abbreviations and acronyms. Next up is the instrument ACS. If you compare the private, instrument, and commercial ACSs, you will see that there are many common changes that have been made. For example, the FAA reorganization of basic med. Since these were covered in the private information, I will not cover those again. There are changes that are specific to the instrument ACS. Those will be covered in the next slides. This is what appears to be a small change in the task objective for Area of Operation 3, Task Alpha. However, it could have significant impact. By not having solely by reference to instruments in the objective line, it allowed this task to be completed without a view limiting device. Now, this task is required to be completed while the applicant uses a view limiting device. For more information about using a view limiting device, please also refer to Appendix 7, page A-15. While Area of Operation 3 Task Alpha is used as an example, this change has been made to numerous tasks. Okay, hold on just a second. There we go. My slides got stuck. Sure, we're correct. Okay, we're good to go. As you can see in Area of Operation 6, Task Alpha, non-precision approach, there has been a noticeable change. We have combined three elements into one. In addition, please look at the reference line for this task. You will see the addition of AC 120-108, Continuous Descent Final Approach. In the 2017 ACS, the applicant was forced to maintain MDA plus 100 minus 0 feet until they missed the MAP. With this change, it allows the applicant to fly a more stabilized approach from the final approach fix without having to level off at the MDA until the MAP is reached. Please refer to AC 120-108 for additional guidance. Most of the changes that we have already covered in private ACS appendices also apply to the instrument ACS appendices, with one exception. Appendix 7, that is titled Aircraft, Equipment, and Operational Requirements and Limitations, under the paragraph Aircraft Requirements and Limitations. This is the new language. Applicants testing in a multi-engine airplane must provide a multi-engine airplane with a published VMC. The only exception is if the airman certificate is limited to center thrust. While this new language may seem like a person cannot accomplish their instrument practical test in an airplane that is limited to center thrust, they may use a center thrust airplane provided their pilot certificate has the center thrust limitation already on it. So the new language does not permit an applicant to use an airplane that is limited to center thrust who does not have a center thrust limitation on their pilot certificate. Now for the commercial. Most of the changes that we have already covered in the private and the instrument ACSs will also be found in the commercial ACS. I do mention configure the airplane as per the manufacturer's recommendation here. As I'm sure most, if not all of you, know that the requirement for a complex single-engine airplane is no longer required for the commercial practical test. Since this has already been shown in the private ACS, I will not cover those specific tasks and elements in the commercial. However, I will cover some of the other changes that are specific to the commercial. First, we will look at the task and elements, then we'll cover the changes in the appendices. When the commercial ACS was released last year, we received numerous emails asking why did we remove the requirement for a commercial pilot applicant to not have to do full stalls. Well, we replied that the removal of full stalls happened by at least 2012, if not earlier. We did listen to the comments. We have now changed the power on and power off stalls to either to an impending stall or to a full stall at the discretion of the evaluator. It is important to note that accelerated stalls are still to be performed to the impending stall. For the commercial pilot appendices, in Appendix 5, the change to remove limited to center thrust was shown in the private ACS slides, but I felt it needed to be shown again for the commercial. The requirements are the same between the private and the commercial. This will be found on page A16. In Appendix 7, you will see where the requirement for a complex airplane for the single-engine practical test was removed. It is important to note that a complex multi-airplane must still be used for a multi-engine practical test. This is the last slide for the updates and the changes to the private, instrument, and commercial ACSs. As you can see, there have been some editorial, clarification, and a few changes to the standards in these three ACSs. I encourage applicants, their instructors, and evaluators to read the entire document. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us in the Airman Testing Branch. For the next few slides, I will cover what is coming up in the development of other ACSs. The FAA and its industry partners on the ACS Working Group are still developing the ACS for ATP airplane and instructor airplane certificates. In 2016, we also started work on an ACS for aircraft mechanic certificate with airplane and/or power plant ratings. The draft of this ACS is now posted on the Airman Testing Branch's website. Once we complete this work, we will be in a position to use these foundational ACS documents as a template for expansion to other certificates and ratings. There are several challenges with the development of the ATP type rating ACS. One challenge that is unique to this ACS is the evaluation standards in the PTS have served two purposes: initial ATP certification and initial type rating qualification. When you add the knowledge elements to the evaluation standard, they don't necessarily apply to a type rating evaluation, unless the initial ATP certification is done concurrently with a type rating. The need for evaluating elements listed on the knowledge test for a type rating, for example, is not necessary because a knowledge test is not required. How we structure the task and draft the guidance for use will be critical. Along those same lines, we now have the required training for the multi-engine ATP certificate, which is a prerequisite for taking the knowledge test. This will be the FAA's first opportunity to capture the knowledge elements for the ATP, CTP in particular in the standards document for those pilots. Unlike other certificates, there is greater difference in what a pilot must know between single-engine and multi-engine class ratings. Another challenge is ensuring that we stick to establishing the evaluation standards, not the training standards. There may be areas that could or should be trained, but not areas that require evaluation. While the document can help with training program development, it is not necessarily all-inclusive. Finally, the ATP PTS has a significant number of notes, more than any other PTS documents. With the existing ACS documents, those notes have been captured in the appendices. We intend to do the same with this ACS. but the volume and nature of the notes is large and is taking quite a bit of time to make sure they are captured appropriately. The instructor ACS, like the ATP ACS, has unique challenges that are not found in the private, instrument, or commercial ACSs. First, the applicant is responsible for the contents of the private and the commercial ACSs. Not only must the applicant be able to know, consider, and do, they must also be able to teach, know, consider, and do. So that makes the structure of the document much different. Currently, our community partners are completing the initial draft. Once the draft is complete, the FAA and our community partners will review the draft. We are planning a tabletop prototype, and the public will have comment opportunity. And here is a quick look at the instructor ACS, at least some of what is completed to this point. Section 1 will be the fundamentals of instructing. Section 2 is for ground instructor. Section 3 is flight instructor airplane. As you can see, there are 15 area of operations, which is 4 more area of operations than are found in the private, instrument, and commercial ACS. Yes, there's a lot of information to cover, and making it a user-friendly document is a challenge. Here's an example of some of the areas of operations and some of the tasks and elements from the instructor ACS. Let's close with a look at some of the resources the ACS team has created to support the use of these documents. The FAA's Airman Testing Webpage is the go-to source. It includes the ACS for private, commercial airplane, and instrument rating airplane, ACS frequently asked questions, an ACS brochure, an ACS PowerPoint presentation with notes, sample private, commercial, and instrument knowledge questions, a What's New in Airman Testing document that includes a list of subjects deleted from airman knowledge tests, the FAA established the ACS Focus Team as a one-stop shop for answering any questions not addressed on the Airman Testing webpage. Please contact the ACS Focus Team directly if you need help. There is no need and no requirement to go to anyone else. Just send us an email to the ACS Focus Team address and you will get a response. Before we wrap up, it is very important to recognize and thank all those who worked so hard on the ACS framework. This slide lists the individuals and organizations in the aviation community who have contributed to the development of the ACS since this project started in 2011. Please join us in thanking these dedicated members of the aviation community and their great contributions. This is our last slide, and as promised, these are the website addresses for the Airman Testing Branch, and the email for the ACS Focus Team is also included. I do thank you for your time and your attention in this webinar. Please feel free to contact us with any questions you may have. I will leave the webinar open for a little bit longer for last-minute questions. Thank you.